Thank you, Professor Friedenberg. Very honored to be here. Thanks everyone for coming today. I know a little bit of snow out there again. It seems like we can't get through the season without having feet and feet of snow, but hopefully today's snow won't last too long. So like I said, honored to be here today. I know, I want to make sure, right? So I've certainly come with a lot of content to talk through, even though there's not accompanying slides. But it's really important, I think, for us to be able to have a dialogue. So if there are questions on your mind, if you hear about AI, right? It's everywhere in the news. You can't go left, right, center without hearing something to do with AI. I think there's things about fear of AI. I think that there's things about automation around AI. And what I'm here today to do is bring my experience, right, over 20 years of experience in working with data, with technology, with systems, and sort of kind of bring the perspective of how I think about AI, right, and share some of that knowledge with you. So let's start out with just a show of hands. How many people have gotten a Netflix recommendation and you have laughed out loud at the recommendation that they've made, right? So you've just binged 3 seasons of Bridgerton, and then all of a sudden Netflix says, well, if you like this, you're going to like this about sewage infrastructure in 1970s Cleveland, right? Or Spotify. You're studying, it's 11 o'clock at night, you've got lo-fi vibes going in the background while you're studying. All of a sudden the Macarena comes on. It's like, nobody asked for Macarena, right? So annoying, kind of funny, low stakes, right? You ignore the song, you ignore the recommendation, life kind of goes on, right? So now I want to put that perspective when you're in a healthcare setting, a doctor. So you're a doctor and you're reviewing your patient's medication history. You've got 3 different systems that you're looking at. The first system tells you what medication was prescribed. The second system is telling you the prescription wasn't filled. The third system is telling you the patient actually had an allergic reaction, right? How does a doctor make sense of 3 different systems? Or you're a loan officer working at a bank, and you have someone who's come to you for a small business loan, right? Again, 3 different systems. One system is giving that person's credit history. The other system is showing you his business transaction data, right? Third system is like, this guy had a fraud alert in 2019, but no one's updated the system. What do? Do you give that person the loan? Do you deny it? That person just doesn't have enough information, right, to make a decision. So it sounds like from the show of hands, I think you're at different places in terms of taking CIS. And I think whether you're a CIS major or some other major, right, from a perspective of this, you're going to learn about, at some point at your time in Bentley, you're going to learn about data, you're going to learn about systems, you're going to learn about coding, you're going to learn about automation, you're going to learn about AI, right? And the single most critical thing underlying all of that is how good is your data, right? Understand that, right? And you probably have heard the expression, garbage in is garbage out, right? I want to give you another sort of nuanced view of that. Disconnection in, think about those examples I gave you, is confusion out, right? And it's a very real world of what we're living in right now. So my path, right, to where I've gone in my career was not linear. So as Professor Friedenberg said, I graduated with a degree in finance and accounting. Sorry, I said finance, but accounting. For me, when I graduated, I was obsessed with money, obsessed with the dollar and how dollars flowed through the organization, right? And how someone decided when you had money over here, how did that get to the other part of the organization, right? So I started meeting people, talking to people. I wasn't obsessed with the math or the journal entries of accounting. I was obsessed with the money, right? And what I found was oftentimes decisions were made based on data, right? And data comes from information. You guys are learning that data lives in systems. And people build and manage the systems. So there's that human element to it. So for me, right, what I started to do is I started to follow the accounting data to the financial data to then operational data, right? And by following operational data, I saw how people in the organization, legal teams, finance teams, customers, partners, product managers, were all interacting with different pieces of data in the organization. So in my career, I've worked at Dell EMC up in Hopkinton, Fidelity Investments, and Johnson & Johnson, right? And I often was the person that was brought in when they were talking about data and systems. I was in that room, right? Not because of some of the technology that I've learned over the years, but more importantly was I could connect the dots between finance, operations. I could understand when there was a regulatory, like a rule around manufacturing that connected to those points. I could understand compliance, and in compliance what it meant to a CFO versus what compliance meant to a clinician, right? Two different views. So, and I think that's an important learning point that I want to stress with you all, right? So at the end of the day, I think linear paths, you're going to learn when you're in here and when you go out into the world, right? If you're in computer systems, many people might say, go build code, go get certified in that code, right? Then go find a role as a business analyst, a developer, a consultant, and that's all great. But I think the people that I've seen that added the most value in their organizations are the people that can understand the business aspect of those things, right? And again, probably things that you're learning in class, but today what I'm hopeful to do, and one of the examples I'm going to take you through is how to do that, what that means in the real world, okay? Any questions, by the way, as I go through this? And tell me if, sometimes I feel like when people frame examples for me, I kind of get the concepts a little bit better, too. And I'll share one, but if you need more, let me know. Is that all right if I'm standing here?
Yeah, no, that's fine.
You're good? Okay. Okay. So let's kind of jump into data. So people talk about data like it's the newest, most important resource, right? We used to talk about oil as an important resource. The problem with oil is it's very physical, right? You can look at a barrel and you can see how much oil is in that barrel. Data is not like that, right? Think about data. Everyone creates data. I talked about legal teams, finance teams, product managers. Let me give you 4 examples, right, of people who work in the same organization and how they think about data, starting with the clinician, right? Clinician is working with the patient. He's working on putting an implant into a patient. What he cares about, right, is the patient outcome. Did I fix that patient, right? Did I have any adverse event? Did something happen while I was doing that surgery that I didn't anticipate? Was there something that I learned about how that procedure went, like in terms of how it worked with a patient? So that person is very much focused on patient-centered data, all about the patient. Then you have the manufacturer, right? The person who's building the implant, the product. What he cares about is that I have a batch of these products that I sell. You'll learn about this at some point in your careers too, that you have specs, engineering specs that say as long as you build that product within the spec, you can call it that product. So he's making sure it's built within that spec, right? And he's also focused on making sure it passes all the quality checks. So from his perspective, he's focused on process-centered data, right? All about the process. Physician is based on patient-centered data. Manufacturing is process. Now you have the regulatory person, the legal person. Legal person is checking all the boxes to make sure, is this device approved? Do I have a certification? Is there anything I need to know about this? So that person's role is very much focused on rules, right? Making sure the rules are met. And then you've got the first person, who's a CFO, or a finance person. Finance person is focused on cost and margins, right? How much money am I making on that device? What's the cost if there's a recall? What's the cost if something goes wrong? So they're very much focused on value. So 4 different people, 4 different systems of data that they're working in. right? None of them talk. So when someone comes up and says, I want to figure out something, I want to make a decision about this product, where do they get that information from, right? Because right now, your systems are fragmented. There's nothing that pulls all that information into one central place, right? And so it's very manual. Any questions about that? Okay. So again, it's just like, so as we're thinking about AI in terms of like, AI is now making information come at us faster, you need to be thinking about, well, how is it coming at us faster, right? How is it, like what people need to be able to do with AI is be able to see a picture, a full picture, right? And how do you do that when you have data living in different systems, people putting in different information into different systems? How do you paint that picture? It's hard, right? It's very hard. So let me go into my J&J example. So I was in J&J working in their sports medicine division. So I don't know how many of you knew this. I didn't know this. But Johnson & Johnson actually has an orthopedics division, medical devices. Who knew? I thought they were Band-Aids and some pharmacy stuff, right? Some drugs, but they have medical device division. So in the European Union, Europe, there was a new regulation that was coming out, medical device regulation. And basically it was all about safety. What the regulators were now requiring was that the manufacturer, legal manufacturer of the product, had to show safety all the way from the clinical outcome, all the way back to the manufacturing of the device, right? So the leader at the time was like, what questions do we need to ask? It was like, okay, what questions do we need to ask? So then it's like, well, we must have all this data, right? And we did. We have clinical data, we have manufacturing data, mounds and mounds and mounds of data at Johnson & Johnson, right? All in different systems, right? And so now it's like the regulators are demanding, in order for you to keep this product on the market and be certified, you need to be rigorous and comprehensive in showing, right, that end-to-end signal that this product is safe, from when it's in the patient's body to when it goes out of your facility, right? So maybe it would help to kind of give you some context of what that means. So I was working with the R&D team, so the product team. It started as a regulatory program, but then as we started to kind of unwind all of this data, one of the things that was becoming very evident was that this was touching every single element of the organization. Not only internal to J&J, but when you think about it, external to J&J, because J&J relies on partners, manufacturing companies, right? So when they're building a device, they don't make the raw materials that go into the device, right? They depend on companies outside to provide those materials to build that device. So in the context, and hopefully I don't make this too confusing, but you can follow through, is that, so I'm talking about bringing people together, and I need to get to the lowest common piece of information, which for this program meant getting to the SKU level. You guys know what a SKU level is, like a product code, right? Like think about like the thing that's on the back of a cereal box that gets zapped. That's your product code. So I need to get to that level. When I go talk to the clinician, right, where I need the clinical outcomes, I was like, I need to get information about this product. And they're like, okay, what are you talking about? I'm like, this product. And they're like, okay, what anatomy? What part of the anatomy are we talking about? I'm like, oh, I don't know. I got to go back and talk to my engineer. I'm like, what part of the body are we talking about? He's like, well, it's a knee implant. I'm like, perfect. That's all I need. So I go back. I'm like, it's a knee implant. It's a knee product. She's like, okay, ACL or MCL? I'm like, does it matter? She's like, yeah, 2 different products, right? 2 different procedures. We talk about procedures. We don't talk about product here, right? Real world, this is J&J. So I'm like, okay, perfect. So I go back, I'm like, all right, so I've got some information. It's MCL versus ACL. Which one are we looking at? He's like, well, let's start with TrueSpan as the product. I'm like, okay, perfect. So we go back, we get the information, we zero it down, we get to TrueSpan. Great. Now I go to regulatory. I'm like, okay, we need to put this puzzle together, right? I need to get all this safety information from a regulatory perspective. And they're like, okay, what are you talking about? I'm like, I start with the SKU, and they're like, yeah, it doesn't really help us. I'm like, are you knee procedure? Not really. I'm like, what do you need? Brand, what's the brand? I'm like, well, the brand is TrueSpan. She's like, okay, let's start working with TrueSpan. And are we talking all the products under the TrueSpan family? I'm like, no, we got to start with one product at a time. We can't bring everything in. I got to start with one product at a time, right? So we're collecting information there. And then I go to finance, right? Because we need to back all of this up like financial sales. I'm like, I need to break out across the world how much money we're making or how much sales we're generating from this product, because they need to see the story, right? They need to see if you're, let's just put it in raw terms, $1 million of sales, they need to see at least 20% of your patients and their outcomes from getting that medical device implanted, right? And when I'm talking about patient outcomes, I'm talking about, think about when you get your knee repaired. It's 3 things that physicians usually, if they're talking to you about, is mobility, right? How quickly can you get moving again? Strength, right? Right after you have the surgery, how fast can you put weight on your knee? And pain, right? And so I need patient data that's coming back and saying, because they got this device, right, that's improved all those outcomes. And we got to prove it back to the regulators, right? And then on top of that, like I said, not only are we doing the clinical piece of it, but you got to go all the way back to manufacturing. I got to go back to manufacturing and get data that says, what's your process for building this product? What are the materials? Because safety, when a regulator is thinking about safety, they're thinking about what kind of materials are you using in that implant? And could it cause a different problem if you use the wrong material, right? What's your sterilization look like process? Because you're putting that device in a box, you got to seal that box up, you got to sterilize it, and it's got to get to the hospital sterilized. And then they're also looking at the procedures, right? What are you telling the hospital? How do you store this product? How long is it good for? You have to be able to tell that story comprehensively, not on just one SKU, but every SKU in your portfolio. So let me just kind of take a step back. So we're talking about AI, right? In this like world of AI, now all of a sudden things are coming at you so fast, right? You know, jobs are getting eliminated because someone can run an analysis report that says, here's what you got, right? You should take action on that. Do you know there was not one report, one system at J&J with what I had that I could go to and get all that information in one picture, right? So I'm not, and we'll talk about this, I'm not skeptical of AI. For me, it's just more of like, there's so much nuance in these. And again, I've worked at big companies, right? Dell, Fidelity, J&J. There's like big data sets out there. There are people that don't normally talk to each other on any given day, right? You work in engineering, you do your engineering job. You work in quality, you do your quality job. At the end of the day, if everybody does their job correctly, you'll get something out the door, right? But when something comes along like a compliance initiative that now says like, prove to us that your products are safe, right? Let me tell you, 2 things that I've seen in my career, and I will tell you, compliance is the number one thing that everyone says, stop everything, jump on this, right? So good news was, and you know, a lot of this, like I said, was back and forth. At the end of the day, I didn't create a new data set. I didn't create a new model. What I created was one version of reality, right? That then helped people that I was working with or working for make decisions. So And I want you to think about this in two ways too. So short term, so the short term objective was for this business, $300 million of business in Europe was protected, right? From doing all this work and figuring this out. Longer term, and this is where I think the real power of AI is going to come back, when you start to put all those pieces together, right, and really understand what's going on, I really do think this is information that can go back to the product teams to say, is there something in this data that tells us how we build a better product? Is there something about this that says, you know, when you start, and I know people get crazy about customer attributes and patient attributes and confidential information, but is there a way we can bucket this information to say, like, when you have an 18-year-old athlete versus a 70-year-old person who just decided to pick up pickleball, right, dealing with the same injury, are there things that we should be thinking about differently? Because right now, everyone just does everything the same way, right, for everyone. So there's that. And then, you know, at the end of the day, the three benefits, like I said, for J&J was we got them certified. Second piece was, and we protected that revenue, right? Because otherwise J&J would, if they weren't certified, would have to go look for different products, different services, different regions of the world to make up for that bucket of money. We were able to give better information, like patients could, and this was in Europe, better information about the devices, because this is all now public information in Europe and their citizens. And then third, we were finally able to put a dashboard together that gave all these different pieces of information in one view. Okay. So again, for me, for AI, powerful for sure, right? I think when it's done right, when you are making sure that the underlying data is good, when you have people that are working in their silos and connecting pieces of information to one another, and you're able to tell a story, not create a new system, not create a new model, but be able to tell a story, then people can make better decisions, right? And that's, like, for me, that's, I think, the misunderstanding, because I think a lot of the misunderstanding today, and don't get me wrong, right, a lot of what's in the news right now about AI and what you hear about is being able to automate tasks, right? Taking things that would take a lot of time, do it cheaper, and automate those tasks. And that's definitely 100% I'm there with that, right? But I think for me, it's like going that next level. I think as the illustration of the J&J example that I just gave you, I think there's so much more potential and power, right? And being able to make decisions, more informed decisions, faster decisions. So for me, it's like that human element of the people that have the context, right? You need the context of, like, what does this data represent? How does it tie into the people that I work with, right? It's building that trust to be able to kind of lean on that information. And then I think when I think about you guys too, right, in your paths and your careers, and thinking about AI, I think more often than not, right, people lead with a tool, right? But think about, the tool is the how. Making sense of what it gives you is the why, and it's the why that adds value, right? And I know, right, we talked about this at lunch a little bit today. I told the story. I first learned about ChatGPT. I'm going to kind of go off in a segue. I first learned about ChatGPT from I think he was a sophomore in high school, right? One day I was writing up a business case. I was like, oh, I just wish someone would just read this. Like, because the people that work for me weren't around. I'm like, I just wish someone could read this and just, like, tell me if it looks good, right? If it's written in the right tone. He was there sitting casually. He's like, why wouldn't you just throw that in ChatGPT? I'm like, I don't even know what that is. So he came over, signed me up, put it in there, ran it. Like, within seconds, I had a report back on, here are your highlights, here are the things that need improvement, here's where I think you need to, like, tighten up your story a little bit, right? So, and I'm telling you, I was, like, torn, because at one I was like, oh my God, like, where has this been all my life? To then, I'm like, Joe, how are you using this? Like, how do you know about this and how are you using it? It's like, well, I sometimes use it for my assignments, and, if I haven't read a book completely through, I can go there and it gives me some kind of update, and I use that and I build on it. I'm like, okay, perfect. Like, again, I see the value in these tools. I see it as sort of the replacement of the Internet Explorers, the Safaris, of just taking big loads of information. Instead of giving you a list of something, right? It's sort of anticipating, why are you asking this? And this is what you need to know, right? And just giving you that food for thought. And that's great, right? But in these bigger organizations, when you're talking about data and these tools being built on top of these systems, it's much bigger than that. So, and for you guys, right, looking at your careers in finance and CIS and accounting, it's not necessarily what you're going to be learning, right, from a technical perspective. What becomes very important, right, and I think this is where it falls apart for me in every single organization that I've worked with. When you come in with just a technical understanding of knowing how to build a tool, right, of being able to code, right? Without that business context, right? You lose the room. You lose your value right away. You do. And on top of, right, so I think Bentley does a phenomenal job of teaching you the hard skills, right? The technical stuff. What I want to share with you, what I think are the more important skills that I see, and you're probably reading about and hearing and, seeing, there are 3 skills that I think become absolutely critical in AI, right? And they're all going to sound like years and years and years of people saying the same thing. But I'm going to give it to you in the context that I view, right? 3 skills are critical thinking, collaboration, communication. Critical thinking, right? And I know it becomes so overused that it seems meaningless. But for me, critical thinking is when someone shows up with some data, you don't take that at face value. You don't look at it and say, like, I've got my answer. You look at it and say, where did this information come from, right? Is this one point of view? When you're looking at something and saying, this analysis, but does that include what the regulator would say, what the legal person would say? Does this include what the finance person would understand about this? How about the customer? Is the customer's voice in this, right? And customer's voice, I will tell you, is probably the most underrated piece of data, right? It's always the last thing that gets connected. And ironically, it's the one most important critical thing that tells you everything you need to know about your business, okay? So critical thinking. Second, collaboration. And I'm not talking about being a team player. I'm not talking about being, part of a team. I'm talking about the ability for you to reach across to somebody who has different experiences, right? Different points of view. In a company might be driven by different incentives, where you sit down with that person and you're saying, here's what I do. How does this connect to what you do, right? And I'll tell you, some of those conversations are probably the toughest conversations that you're going to have. Because my experience has always been knowledge is power. And once you ask somebody to give up that information, right, they feel like they're giving up their power, right? So you always have to come at it from a non-intimidating, I've always come at it from a point of view of like, we're trying to solve for this. And I know I can only solve for part of this. You need to help me fix the rest of it, okay? And then communication. Communication is what builds trust, right? Being able to look at something, review something, feel good about something, and then go and talk about something. And the other thing from a technical perspective, right, that I've always found are people talk in terms of the model, right? They talk in terms of the algorithm, right? What you need to be talking about is the consequence, right? So when you look at a model and it says it gives me an 87% run rate, well, what does that mean, right? In business terms, and this is like, things are moving so quickly, in business terms it means 1 in 8 patients has this problem. It's like, okay, what are we going to do about that? Don't give me the 87%. Tell me what the impact is, right? So those are all things, right, that, you got to put the context to it, because then once you start to put the context to it is when people start to listen, people start to trust, people start to fund, right, your initiatives. Okay. And so, like I said, there's so much more that I can offer on this, but, in closing, for me, I think for the last 20 years of my career at least, IT, customers, CIS, computer systems, it's always been about data infrastructure systems. It's always been about, how do we store data reliably? How do we automate a process, right? But now, the next 20 years, I think, is what's going to be defining, is how does data flow through an organization? How does it get from the process, from the beginning of the process to the end of the process, all the way back in again, right? How does it interact with the people within your organization? How does it interact when you need information? That J&J example that I gave you, I needed to go outside of J&J's walls, right? So it's not just the data that's within the company's organization. It's going outside and saying, for that raw material supplier, what's in that material that goes into that medical device, right? I need you to disclose all that information to me. I need you to disclose to me how you manufacture that product, right? Because I need to share that back with those regulators. So again, I think it's going to be that frame of mind that you all need to get into where, as AI starts to become more prevalent in the things that we do, make sure that you're taking a step back, right, in the roles that you play, whether it's in an internship, whether it's at a job, whether you're looking at a business case, right, and truly understanding, where did this data come from? What's it telling me? Whose perspective is in it? What's the cost of action? What's the cost of not action, right? And, like I said, the topic of my book, and this is why I wrote the book, is AI isn't enough, right? Because you really need to understand what's behind the data, what's behind the workflows, right? You need to be able to, not worry about the technology, because as advanced as the technology will get, and it'll just continue to get better. You need to, there's no substitution for the human piece that adds the context, right? The contextual understanding that builds the trust within the organization, right? That communicates it in a way that everyone can understand it and connect perspectives. So that's what I had for the most part for what I wanted to offer here today. So I sort of want to just open it up and see what thoughts people have, and if this is resonating, if it helps. Go ahead, Aiden.
I mean, for me, I really agree, and I think what resonates with me a lot is kind of this idea that data is the foundation of business, especially moving forward.
Yes.
And I think I really agree, we kind of get caught up a little bit in the automation and what it's able to do for us now, but the focus of more the next 20 years of how this is going to change business and what steps. I'm also wondering what steps do you think that businesses need to take today to be prepared for the next couple decades in this changing industry? Yeah,
so like I said, I think that when I look at, and I can only speak to it from more of the bigger, more of the companies that I've worked at that size. I really do think, and I think a lot of companies right now have taken the bolt-on AI stuff and done some experiments, right? And I think you can go anywhere right now and read, we're not getting the return on our investment right now. What's going on? We invested in all these tools. And I will tell you, my experience is until you do that data governance that I described, so if you're in manufacturing, right, doing what you did with J&J, it's well, how is data created, right? And even starting with the endpoint in mind of it goes out to the customer, right? Back that all the way up, right? How does it even get to that point? Making those connections, making sure there's common language. I think the biggest thing that falls down in companies is that there's no common language, right? Like I said earlier, it's always been traditionally, if you do your job right in engineering, you do your job right in quality, you do your job right in finance, all of these pieces will just, come together. But now it's starting, AI is starting, it's coming up with an insight to the, one of the things that we talked about earlier was that this product is underperforming, right? Those are the types of insights that are showing up in companies right now. And companies are you talk to any one person, right? You talk to 5 different people, everyone's going to have that version of why that product needs to stick around, right? And then, right, so if you don't have that common language, if you don't have that common set of priorities, if you're not aligned, and I think the other thing that you're gonna start to see with companies is the structures, reporting structures within companies are gonna start changing. How they're incented, right? Because right now it's, there's this kind of path up, right? You work in development, you eventually get to a senior leadership position. I think now you're going to start to level off. And it's not so much going this way, but going across and building, right? An understanding of all those pieces in the organization.
Yeah, so like being able to almost like understand and think from every different like perspective of a business, right? Being able to understand maybe like the way the tech people think about things, being able to translate that to like the way HR thinks about things or marketing, and then kind of coming together, right, like as a team, knowing that it's the intersection of this is where usually like solutions and things lie,
come,
right?
yeah.
And is that where you also think that machine learning and like AI has the most value, is kind of helping unify these people? Or
I think the danger in thinking that AI can bring those pieces together is that right now, until the work is done, because right now you have fragments of systems, right? And what they're generally doing is putting AI on a fragment of a system, because there's nothing in an organization right now that pulls that into one place, right? Yeah. So I think, the issue is that it will bring people together, but not in the right terms.
Okay, yeah.
Right?
So it can almost help instead, like, each of the people understand, like, they're expert in their subject, right? So they can almost use AI to get, like, the most relevant insights, the most up-to-date information, and then they can come together, hopefully all on the same, understanding of language. Like, you talked about, like, an active customer. Like, this could mean different things to all
the different companies. And I think it starts with the fundamentals of who's building the model,
yeah.
right? So whoever's building that model should be going out there and saying, like, I'm in the shoes of the CFO today. I'm in the shoes of the product person today, right? I'm building this model and collecting all this data, right? What's the common language that connects all of this? Because like that J&J example that I gave you, right, where one person talks about it as a knee procedure, right? Versus I need to get as specific as like the product code. And then it's like I go and it's like, well, which brand are you talking about, right? There's 5 different brands. And it's like, is this what we need to do? And they're like, yeah, like welcome to medical devices, right? So it's like, how do you build a tool, an AI tool on top of that when you don't have common language, right, across an organization? So again, I think it's up to whoever's building the model. And the best advice I got in my career was when I was working in sales finance at EMC, and a senior leader came up to me because I had made this comment on some forecast that I said we should take a look and see if there's anything we can do to drive expense improvement here, right? And very professionally, he was like, you know what? Until you walk a day in the shoes of a salesperson and understand why we spend what we spend on that line item, you can't come back with a recommendation like that. So what did I do? I didn't pick up a sales quota, but I found a way to go work with the sales organization to figure out what does that exactly mean, right? And that's what started to make me valuable to the organization, because I was willing to come out of my swim lane to kind of go get someone else's perspective.
Yeah.
So, other questions? You guys frightened? Yes.
So 3 years ago, generative AI came on the market and took over everything and changed the way we did what we do.
Yeah.
And more recently, we've been looking at AI and agents and how AI tools can do things for us. What do you think is the next big AI thing? Will it be AI robots? Will it be... What do you think is coming up on the horizon?
Yeah, so, and like I said, I think there's so much rhetoric out there right now. Like, I call it rhetoric. And I think that there's good things, like the generative AI. I gave you that example. Taking something I wrote, coming up with a recommendation how to make it better. Perfect. Agentic AI. I struggle with the agentic AI in a customer support situation, and here's why. When I worked in customer support in EMC, and someone was calling on the other line, you know, it seems like customer support is where the natural place where a lot of like the agentic AI is taking place. There is so much that's going on in that customer situation at the moment. So the fact that we think we're automating that support, right? And I haven't seen an upfront and close kind of perspective on it, but there could be some things that we're doing to maybe validate some information about the customer, but it goes so much deeper than that, that not one system in any company can capture all that information, right? So, and I know you're asking the question of what comes next. I mean, I think it's a pause on AI, and I think there's two things that need to be solved for. One, right, I think is the sustainability issue that we're about to come up against with energy and building data centers, right? And how do you do that? Because 20 years ago when I was talking to customers, they were complaining back then, right? They couldn't afford any more storage boxes. They couldn't afford to build out any more data centers. And you think about all that time since then, I mean, I don't even know what exponential we've increased the number of, like, how much data we're creating. So at some point, it's like, they're saying they're going to make this investment today, and I keep thinking, well, this isn't a one-time investment. You got to keep making that investment, right? You're going to run out of space. And I know people are talking about going to the planets and the moon and all of that, but so I think that there's a piece about that needs to be figured out. But then I think it also comes back fundamentally to the piece, like, if everything's important, nothing's important, right? And I think that's why I wrote this book, because for me, it's like, let's tap the brakes. Because at the end of the day, not all data is created equal. Not all data is critical, right? So where are we setting our priorities? And I really do think that in setting those priorities is really understanding. And there's very few people in your organizations that know how that end-to-end really works, right? And I know, right, companies that I'm talking to are struggling. Is it HR, right? Does HR own that end-to-end because they own all the people that are doing the work? Is it IT, right? So I think for me, it's more a tap the brakes a little bit. I mean, I think the robotics thing for sure, yes. People without, or driverless cars, all of that, you know, yes, great. Futuristic, right? For me, it's like, well, let's take the power, because I really do think the power of AI, back to the example that I gave again with J&J, the short term was getting them certified, right? Making sure they could keep product in Europe. But the more important piece is like, what are we learning now when we start to connect the end to end? What is it about these products, right? What works well? What could be better, right?
What other questions do you have, or if there's some that Jane said that you'd like to react to that you either didn't think about or that made an impact on you, we'd love to hear from you. Okay.
I was a bit curious on your views on like the current landscape of AI. Obviously, it's like increased vastly how much information is being pushed out. But and the way most of these generative AI systems work is like they took large-scale data from the internet books, like all recorded history.
Yes.
And it uses and it studied that and like creates like actionable responses when we request something from it, like in the form of a question. But I feel like over time, just because there's so much more information being pushed out, we'll get to a point where AI is kind of like making more data based on like the current AI stuff that's out. So it's like essentially eating itself.
It's eating. Like, so you're saying from like what happens to the historical context, because like every day you're generating new data, and what happens to the old stuff that you started to make your decisions on, right? It's a great question. I mean, I think this is going back to, it depends, right? Whether you're a consumer, whether you're a business. I mean, I can only talk at it from a business landscape. And the reality is, like, things are changing, right? Real-time decisions need to be made, and companies need that, right? They need that because, you know, every example up until this point, and that continues today, more often than not, right? You have analysts that are being asked to go run a report, right? And the fact of the matter is, depending on what that person is trying to figure out, they're going into the systems, right? They're trying to get the data. They're reconciling the data. Then they're trying to come up with a narrative. and then they're handing the report over, and it's 2 weeks since you got that information, right? So it's great because you can still have the historical context of that for the next time you run it. But now, the reality is information is happening so quickly. And that's my fear with a lot of the organizations is they're just putting AI on top of it and looking at like financial data that happens today and say like, all right, what's the latest? What should I be making a decision on? And it, and this is why like I say it's so important to have that context. So just because that says that today, what's the context that a week ago, right? Something happened in your supply chain that forced it to change this week, but like, let's not make the change, right? Like, let's wait because like a week ago was something else. And that's that AI won't give you that, right? It's just a point in time, a real time answer. So you need that context of someone that understands what happens to be able to decide where you go next. Is that helpful? Yeah. Other questions? Other insights? What are you guys excited about with like jobs? And I mean, I know, like I said, I read the news and see like AI is taking this away and entry-level jobs and this and that and the other thing. But what are you guys thinking? All good?
What do you think about like, I feel like a lot of the people making the decisions around AI are like really the people like at the very top. Like, how do you think that we as like a society and people can have like more of a voice in shaping the future of AI?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's a great question, and I think that there'll be, I think in some cases for me, when I look across everything, I think we're in some need of regulation around AI. So it's not necessarily going to come from here always. I think I think it will come from here because something's going to happen, right? Either AI is going to turn into a bubble and everyone's going to say all this investment was like not worth, right, what we put into it, and people start to scale back, and that's very much reality. But then I think that there's the piece that says, when it starts to get out of control, now you need somebody to kind of step in and say, like, where does this stop?
So it's like a delicate balance.
It is, because, people are seeing, I mean, I see it all the time. Like, I see people that are like, oh my God, like, you just took things that took us months to create in seconds, right? And we have information. It's like, and I always slow them down. I'm like, okay, great. Like, I get this is where you want to go, but we got to just make sure this is a fully rounded picture, right? Because, like, when we make a decision, we got to understand what the customer impact is or what it's going to mean to a supplier, right? And can they react as quickly as we want to react? So, yeah.
The last sentiment like makes me think, like you mentioned, like in your book, like define then deploy.
Yes.
And so like I feel like that really applies to kind of what you're saying. Like
yeah.
You need to define like the context and define the entire environment before we can kind of put, like you've said, like put these AI systems on top of the business, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I mean, I think I grew up in the world, and I don't know if there is any more, I don't know, do they still talk about Lean Six Sigma or Six Sigma in courses? So, so it's like, it's more just design thinking. So do they talk about design thinking is probably what's taking it over, right? So in the world that I grew up with, when I started, especially because EMC is a manufacturing company, they build storage boxes, right? So, everything was very much what's the problem you're trying to solve for, right? And it wasn't just the problem you're trying to solve for. What's the metric that's going to move when you solve for this problem, right? So I think it's coming back to, like we talked about this earlier, it's just coming back to basics. Like a lot of what business is coming back to is just the basics of what you should have been doing in the first place. Yeah. So I'm excited for all you guys because I think you're coming into a world like, as much as like zone out the fears and like what you hear and what you read, because I really do think the next 20 years isn't going to be shaped by the technical aspects. Like we've already figured out, right, how to store data, how to make systems, like create systems so that we can manage a customer relationship separate from like how do we interact with the supplier and do our materials planning, like figured all of that out. Right? I think what becomes now most important is the context, the contextual. Once you start to see data coming across systems, like meeting people, talking to people, coming out of your zone. Like what I'm most excited about was early in my career, it was just stay in your lane, right? Stay in your work lane. If you're a finance person, stay in that lane. I'm like, no. Like I want to go meet as many people and talk to as many people and make sure the job that I'm doing, right, is either helping them or if it's hurting them, how do I fix it? Right? And this is what I see as AI being, is like, how do you go have those conversations, meet new people, right? And for me, it was like every project I've ever done wasn't in just the office I worked in, right? It was 3 time zones away, right? From a manufacturer supplier that was in Israel, right? That I needed to figure out, and I can't even tell you how many times I got it wrong, like, when are we gonna meet? Like, I couldn't get the time zones right. But, you know, having those conversations, making those relationships, building those relationships, because I think that's what's going to become pretty critical in the world of AI. So hopefully this was helpful, giving you some different insights. Hopefully it doesn't detract anything from what you're learning. Hopefully it supplements some of what you're learning. But like I said, I think the future is bright. And I know as Bentley grads, you're all going to do exceptional, right? I think every time I was ever hiring, I always drew from the Bentley pool because I knew what I was getting. I knew people were going to be curiosity, right? The skills I talked about earlier, critical thinking, teamwork, right? Not teamwork, but collaboration, like communication. Communication is so vitally important because more often than not, people don't like to talk. So for me, it was always, if they didn't want to talk business, I would find the thing that would start, right? Like most of the guys like to talk hockey. I love hockey. Like it was the door in, right? Open that door. But being able to communicate, build that trust, right? Come at it from a perspective of like, we want to all make this together, right? It's not about me. I'm not trying to be anybody or be anywhere. I'm just trying to make this all work. So that's all I got. Thanks, everybody.